So wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting. Sunil Tamrakardai was a head boy at my high school, and you can't say no to him. I still have that image of him as a stern but very affable leader back in the day. And also good to acknowledge the presence of many of the alumni of Buddha Elementary School, of which we have many fond memories. I intend to speak for about 20 minutes on Nepal 2030. Right? We hear a lot about how the country is clueless on where it wants to go, how it wants to achieve its goals. Just want to get you started by informing you that we actually have pretty good plans, pretty good goals and objectives on where we want the country to reach by certain international deadlines, and there are all these international benchmarks that we use to compare ourselves with, track our progress, etc. So it's not that we are as clueless as we are portrayed to be in the media. The first major national goal that we have is to graduate out of LDC status, which means there's this category of least developed countries that Nepal has been part of over the last 50 years. And this was a special club of poor countries in the world. Started with a list of 25, eventually grew to almost 50. Now we're in the process of whittling it down, almost halving it. But we actually failed in that effort over the last decade. Nonetheless, many countries are in the pipeline. And here in the Asian continent, Nepal, Laos, and Bangladesh are on the verge of graduating. We would have graduated in 2022. With a transition period of about 2 to 3 years because of COVID. A lot of these deadlines were extended. So we are finally coming out of this category of least developed country, and will be like any other developing country by November 2026, but there are these transition periods to be built in. So I think in our country's development trajectory, this will be something to celebrate. The second set of goals we have is what many people know or acknowledge by the name of Sustainable Development Goals. So this is a package of goals, about 17 goals, subdivided into 169 targets, and we measure and track the progress of these goals through almost 232 internationally agreed indicators, but Nepal has been clever to add another 250 indicators. So we have tons of indicators to measure and verify our progress. The third goal we have as a country over the next 10-15 years is to also to become a respectable middle-income country. So the definition of middle income is fairly elastic. We use the World Bank's classification. Any country that has an average per capita income of around $1,100 to up to $12,000 per person per year are categorized as middle income. But there's a threshold at around $4,000 per person per year, where you cross from the lower middle income to an upper middle income country. So these are all goals that we are pursuing through our annual budgets, through these periodic plans that the National Planning Commission and the government of Nepal introduces. And it's not just a government goal, right? So this is a state goal. So in that regard, all the private sector efforts, civil society efforts, community efforts, even household expenditures are expected to contribute to these. So what are these goals set against? So let me highlight 3 big trends, transitory trends that we must address or acknowledge or internalize if we are to be on this path of sustainable development. The first relates to the entire planet, the globe, and many of you are following the discussions on climate change, how the climate is impacting our daily lives, how the planet is warming, how this has been an impact of modern economic growth, and how we need to transition out of this fossil fuel dependent path of development into a more greener, more sustainable modes of living, right? Now, just to give you some big numbers, I don't know if you know the age of our universe. It's about 14 billion years. The age of our Earth, the planet, the tiny planet that we inhabit, is about 4 billion years old. Homo sapiens, people like us, came into existence about 300,000 years ago. So it's a very short period. Civilization as we know it probably began around 8 to 10,000 years ago. So all these episodes of Ramayana and Mahabharata are actually feels ancient to us, but it's only about 7,000 years old. So in this huge continuum, relative to the age of the universe and our planet, people like us have been engaging in activities, economic and social activities, really just for the last 10,000 years or so. But modern economic growth, as we know it, started just 200 years ago. So 1820 was that tipping point when the world, in its long history of over 300,000 years, set itself on this path of sustained economic progress. So we were accustomed to expect annual growth rates of at least 1% or 2% year after year after year, only after 1820. So it's a very short, in the large continuum, or in the large perspective of planetary existence, we have known modern development in its current form. You know, the shiny buildings, the roads, the electricity, all the vehicular movement, fancy aeroplanes, rockets, all the gadgets that we all carry. This is very, very, very recent, right? So the point to note here is, but the exertion on the planet over the last 200 years as a result of modern economic growth has been so intense that in the year 2020, in the year of COVID, when we were all locked down and trapped in our homes, it was also revealed in a very prestigious journal, Science, that the collective weight of everything that man has produced, human beings have produced over the last 200 years plus, but largely in the course of modern economic development. So this is the steel, the concrete, Alcatra and all these things that we consider to be modern, is about 1.1 trillion tons. And that for the first time in human history exceeded the combined, the cumulative weight of everything that is living. So it was a momentous tipping point, the year 2020, which was just 2.5 years or 3 years ago. And why is this important? That was a signal, that was a wake-up call, that the amount of pressure, the amount of exertion, what we call in Nepali to be dohan and tsar, is so intense that we are crossing those tipping points. So all this is related to the global warming, the intense activities, and that is affecting us, right? Here on the foothills of the Himalayas that we inhabit, our farmers, the urban population, the water scarcity, the erratic monsoon patterns, etc. That is going to be severe and much more unpredictable in the days to come. So we are, after 12,000 years of a geological era called the Holocene, we're now transitioning to an era of Anthropocene. So in Nepali we call it almost Prithvi ko pralaya, the existential angst that is surrounding the very health and life of the planet, this tiny planet that we inhabit, is extremely, extremely important. And this is going forward in the 21st century. This will shape the kind of development roadmap that we adopt, the kind of lifestyle that you and I are going to choose will be governed by this very existential question of how we conduct and govern ourselves in the Anthropocene. Right? So that's a very, very big shift that we need to acknowledge and internalize. The second big shift that is happening in the region of Asia Pacific, is for the first time in about 200 years, roughly coincided with the concept of modern economic growth. China, India, and other populous and large Asian countries are on the ascent, which means in 1820, when that modern economic growth takeoff happened, China and India alone accounted for almost 60%, or minus Japan, almost 60% of world output. So world GDP is around, gross domestic product is around $100 trillion a year, but in that era, it was much smaller obviously, but 60% of that was accounted for by just India, China, and some large countries like Indonesia. What happened after the Industrial Revolution? The great divergence started, and India and China dropped to about 9% in the aftermath of the Second World War. Now that is being redressed. That imbalance is being redressed with the slow rise of both China, India, and other populous countries in the Asia Pacific. So it is forecasted that we will reclaim at least 50% of the world output in the course of this century. What does that do? It has huge implications for the voice, the legitimacy, the exercise of soft power, the exercise of hard power, already we are witnessing those geopolitical rivalries and geopolitical shifts in our region. So we need to internalize that as something that we need to safeguard our sovereignty against. But we as economists, as a small, living in a small, poor country, landlocked country, I see it as a source of many, many opportunities and possibilities, right? In the form of middle-class tourists that will fly into Nepal, in the form of concessional finance that we can access to feed or to at least quench this thirst for infrastructure financing that we have, this massive deficit that we have in the country. We are, after Afghanistan, the poorest country in the Asia Pacific. So all that concessional finance, foreign direct investment, tourism, and other modes of technology transfer is something that we need to absorb, internalize, to power our own growth, but in a more sustainable and green or eco-friendly manner. The third major transitory shift that we are witnessing is within our country. I don't know if you read the newspapers yesterday, the trend of massive out-migration from the hills has finally been confirmed in our latest Rashtriya Janagadana, the national census that happens every 10 years, revealed that over the last 10 years, between the last census and this census, 34 of our 77 districts are rapidly depopulating. So people are leaving their farms, people are leaving their villages in the pursuit of better lives, in search for jobs, education opportunities, health opportunities, earning opportunities. And what is that doing? You see all around you, in Bhaktapure, in Kathmandu, in Lalitpur, in Dan Valley, in Pokhara, along the Mahendra Rajmarga, along Prithvi Highway. Basically 80% of Nepal will be inhabiting about 20% of our landmass. This is not bad in its own right. If we can get the urbanization story right, it can be an endogenous source of economic growth in our in its own right. But the haphazard urbanization that we're pursuing is actually not helping much. But this is the story that we need to internalize, and this is married with the young demographic composition of Nepal. Right, half the country is under the age of 25, and in about 2030, when Nepal hits that SDG deadline of 2030. We will begin our journey of becoming an aging society. And by about 2052, we will have become an aged society. So in that regard, this window for rapid catch-up, relative to not just Singapore and Taiwan and Indonesia and other Thailand even relative to much poorer countries like Cambodia or Vietnam or even Bangladesh in our neighborhood, we're missing that opportunity because of poor governance and the shoddy democratic leadership that we've been witnessing over the last few decades. So this narrowing of catch-up, narrowing of this demographic window that we have is a cause for concern, and this is something we as citizens should be reflecting in our work on advocacy, and pressuring the politicians to get their acts together and really expedite the pace of reforms. Right? What happens if we miss many of these opportunities? The big fear, as I've been saying in other forums, is we as a Nepali society, of course there's a great heterogeneity within the society, but on average, we will be a very mature and very old society without ever having made it to the club of a decent middle-income country. Right? Dhani nabanikana budo bhanne jokhe. That's what we say in Nepali. So that's a huge paradox if you don't get many of these priorities right. We would have become a very urban society without ever having gone through this period of meaningful industrialization. So Sahariya Samaj, without having ever absorbed the character of an industrial society. And that's going to be very painful. The paradoxes that undergirds that phenomenon will have huge consequences. And finally, we are globally connected, but we're not participating in any modes of global interactions in any substantive way. Right? So we are watching from a peer, the marginalized, the mukdarsak, as we say in Nepali. So globally connected, but on the margins of economic, on the fringes of economic engagement. So this breeds civic discontent. This breeds the kind of anarchism that we're witnessing on the social media. So huge sociological implications. So political, environmental, economic, sociological, all this mixture will probably have a lot of consequences that we are not used to addressing or resolving. And this will need to be studied by scholars, of course, but also addressed by leaders. Now, in Nepal, I think we have 3 or 4 distinct resources that we have. The first is water, resources around water, but not just to produce hydroelectricity, which is becoming much more important source of powering our growth, clean source of energy, to displace dirty sources of fuel on the Indian subcontinent. Even Bangladesh, I was there in Dhaka for a few days ago, and they are making rapid progress. But a lot of the energy needs that they have is reliant on dirty sources. Right? So Nepal, with our hydro surplus, clean energy exports, can play a big role in displacing those dirty sources of fuel. We becoming a decent global citizen, contributing to the world economy, contributing to the planetary peril that I discussed earlier. But that's not it, right? The control of floods, irrigation availability, agricultural resource that water provides, and a lot of drinking water needs as our society is rapidly urbanized. I think all that should be monetized. And here there's a lot of best practices from around the world. The Canadian and the Americans have done it well on the Columbia River Treaty, for example. So there's a lot to emulate, conditional on us having that set of seasoned and very wise leaders to govern this resource. The second enabler for our rapid takeoff is really digitalization. And everything where distance and weight are rendered less salient for our production. So the shipping-dependent mode of production and exchange and trade, integration with the rest of the world, that was the dominant mode in the 20th century when other Asian peers caught up with Western countries and Western offshoots, is perhaps penalized us in the 20th century. But in this century, if we can reorient our production paradigms towards stuff that is weightless and distanceless, largely digitalization, services, I think there's a lot that can be done here. And the regional connectivity opportunities to connect with India, connect with China, but on different modes of connectivity, I think presents a lot of opportunities. Half of China that joins Nepal on our north, only 6% of the Chinese live there. Right? So I think air connectivity is a much more applicable, much more relevant mode of connectivity with China. Whereas on the south, 1/3 of India, in terms of geomass that adjoins Nepali boundaries, 50% of Indians live there. So land and rail and water connectivity makes much more sense. Now, when we talk about development, of course, per capita income is a major indicator that is internationally comparable. It's very useful to benchmark ourselves against them, etc. But within Nepal, I think this narrative, what we call in Nepali to be bhashya, how do you understand? 2 minutes? Okay, so is in terms of increased productivity, increased formalization of the workforce, and increased social mobility. I think these are much more salient indicators that we should observe and track our progress in each of our households, across each of our nagarpalikas and gaonpalikas, and us as a national unit. But all this is conditional on us having effective government, susasana, not just effective government, but also governance is an issue. Right? And on this path, as we pursue these grand ambitions against a lot of headwinds and tailwinds, opportunities and challenges on the global front, regional front, these national shifts that we are witnessing, there are certain risks that we need to mitigate. The first major risk that I see is on disasters, right? Slow disasters and rapid disasters. Most of us witnessed the 2015 earthquakes. I was in government when we responded to that, the short-term relief measures, the medium-term recovery measures, and the long-term post-earthquake reconstruction. That showed us how vulnerable we are. What a vulnerable topology that we inhabit, living in the foothills of these fragile Himalayas. Right? So a lot of pre-disaster investments should be internalized in much of the development financing, in the private sector financing. what in the current literature is referred to as resilient infrastructure. This should be very much our priority. The second risk is rapid and massive depletion of human capital. A lot of our younger folks are really disillusioned with the way the country is run. They don't see much hope inside the country, the economic opportunities, and yet they are globally connected. Everybody is on Twitter, everybody is seeing what their fancy friends are doing and posting on Facebook. So this raises the social aspirations and expectations. Right? So this massive flight of talented, young, promising capital will contradict with the larger ambitions that we have for rapid catch-up. How are we going to be a respectable middle-income country by 2030, 2035? How are we going to meet 169 Sustainable Development Goal targets? How will we manage this process out of our graduation from least developed country? So these are profound questions that we need to stare in the eye and grapple with as policymakers, as leading members of society. Finally, the risk that we have to manage is what economists euphemistically refer to as the neighborhood effect, neighborhood effect. Now, this is manifest not just in the shenanigans of the spies and the diplomats and the asymmetric pressure that we often witness from our southern and our northern neighbors, but in much more mundane ways. Right? It could be air pollution that we import from India. So Lumbini is said to be much more polluted than Ratnapark, for example. Now that's not because Lumbini is suddenly heavily industrialized. It's the import of dirty pollution, the black carbon, that is ruining us, because air pollution knows no boundaries. Right? Infrastructure coordination. We need to really work together with India. Even if we have this dazzling 8-lane expressway from Kathmandu to Birgans that takes us there in about an hour, if India doesn't make a counterpart expenditure on a similar infrastructure from Birgans or Roxor to Kolkata, a lot of our efficiency and productivity gains will be minimized. Right? So a lot of infrastructure coordination, by virtue of us being not just landlocked, but actually India-locked, raises these risks to be managed. Our monetary policy, एक से भारू is एक से 60 Nepali rupiah, right? Our monetary policy is actually constrained. A lot of our monetary autonomy is constrained in that regard. So it's not just this Tulodai breathing down our neck, but a lot of these other issues, by virtue of our geographical location, poses risks that need to be internalized, managed, mitigated. Some of those risks cannot be eliminated, just mitigated, but it again needs a lot of wise thinking, statesman-like leadership to manage these geopolitical weights. So, but there are a lot of reform areas that we all should be championing. On the political front is this distinction between liberal and illiberal democratic practices. I won't go into the details. I can speak for another 2 hours on this. But this is an urgent area of reform. On the bureaucracy, our Karmachari Tantra, fundamentally, conceptually, I think it's really a mismatch between functions and attributes. So by functions, it's the regulatory policy making, fiscal management, service delivery, crisis response, completely at odds with the attributes that this bureaucracy is exhibiting in the form of capability, integrity, openness, and innovation. Right? So these things are then giving rise to sheer incompetence on a mass scale, risk aversion, corruption, and this really remarkable hostility to the private sector. And on the business front, I'm not happy with the businessmen either, the entrepreneurs who are supposed to be driving this growth process. There's this political economy of rent seeking at the heart of everything that we do, and increasingly our entrepreneurs are not pursuing the fruits of entrepreneurship, and partly that's because of this hostile regulations, taxations, etc. With this intense lobbying and this unholy alliance that is formed between our businessmen and the political process, given the larger flaws in our electoral process, is also something to be reformed greatly. So let me stop there. Some big goals, some big transitory trends that we need to internalize and respond to, but also tons of opportunities. If only we look inwards and realize what we have and what it would take to harness those resources for our common well-being. Thank you so much.